God knows us. God searches the depths of who we are. God is with us when we sit down. God is with us when we stand up. God knows our paths before we travel them. And even before we say something, even before the words have passed our lips, God knows them. This is especially troubling because we don't always say words of love. We don't always say constructive things. How can we do this if God knows what we're going to say before we say it? The psalmist doesn't say that God intervenes, just that God sees. God knows. So, what's the point? I leave the psalm for a moment and go to the epistle of James, who says, the tongue is a fire. It stains our bodies. No one can tame it. The tongue is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless God and curse those who are made in God's image. The same mouth blesses and curses. This is the mouth God sees. This is the life God watches. James says we shouldn't act like that. Our words and our actions should bring God glory. We should say things that are constructive, and yet we don't all the time. Sometimes we say things that actually tear one another or other people down. James also provides an example of these words, these very words that God so clearly sees. In Psalm 139, verse 4, James 3:11 says, the same spring cannot produce both fresh and brackish water. Many, many years ago, I went on my first trip to the Everglades. I was checking in, where we were checking into the ranger station, and you have to apply for a permit and say where you're going to be in the Everglades. And the Everglades can be an inhospitable territory, so the ranger was going over all of our equipment with us and making sure that we had an adequate supply. Being a good Appalachian mountain hiker, I was prepared. And so she asked how much water we were bringing, and I told her, and then I said, it's no problem, because if we run out, I've brought my trusty water purifier. She said, that's no good. Where you're going in the Everglades, it's mostly brackish water, a mix of salt water, the seawater, and the fresh water flowing through the Everglades. That same body of water cannot be both salty and fresh at the same time. And she pointed out that unless my water purifier was capable of desalinization, it would be of no use. You'd better bring enough water. This is the life that God watches. We cannot be both holy and unholy at the exact same moment. God knows what we face. In Psalm 139, God goes beyond the cosmic creator who put the moon and stars in place, and we discover a very personal God, a God who cares about us and the daily details of our lives. Everything that we face, everything that we encounter, God sees. The psalmist prays, you formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Virtually every line has something that includes both a you or a your and an I, a me or a my. Psalm 139 is the most personal expression in Scripture of the Old Testament's radical monotheism. It's a doctrinal classic because it portrays our existence in all of its dimensions in terms of God's knowledge, presence, and power. God is with us. God's here, not just right now, but in all of those moments, wherever we go and whatever we do and whatever we encounter, God is there. And my problem with this passage And this version of God's presence and intervention is, what about those other times? Choir, you know what I'm talking about, those other times. Those times when if God was there, it wouldn't have gone that way. Kant, the philosopher, writes, examples are the leading strings of the power of judgment. In other words, examples help us understand and support our point or our belief. And we can find lots of examples of God's intervention. We can find examples to support those times when we know God was there, God was with us. We could say, God watched over me on my journey. That's like 139 verse 3. God guided my words to be beautiful or useful at least. Verse 4. God heard my prayers and healed my friend. Verse 4. The problem is Psalm 139 doesn't say God intervenes. The problem is not finding examples to support the notion of God intervening, God being present, God here right now, God being with me in the Everglades all those years ago. Obviously, the trip worked out fine. Obviously, we had enough water. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. The problem isn't finding examples to support the point. It's those pesky counterexamples. Those things that undermine that sense of a personal intimacy with God. The psalmist says, you search out my path, and yet just weeks ago, Christmas Eve 2017, in Lillington, North Carolina, a Christmas tree caught fire in the home of Ed and Sarah Bedingfield. Ed is the pastor of Memorial Baptist Church, which is nearby Lillington, North Carolina. They had just returned home from the Christmas Eve worship service. I can identify with that because I did the exact same thing, except when I got home, my Christmas tree didn't catch fire. They returned home, and when the fire started, one of their neighbors commented about how, from across the street, how rapidly it engulfed the whole house in flames, and Sarah did not make it out. Sarah's 68 years old when she died. You searched my path, the psalmist says. Why mine? Why not Sarah Bedingfield's? I feel God's presence. I feel God's presence in this moment. I feel God with me often. And I feel like I can testify to God watching my path. But the counterexamples, and you all know some of your own, but the counterexample of Sarah Bedingfield illustrates the multidimensional nature of engaging with God. Schleiermacher says God consciousness is the feeling of absolute dependence on God. And many people feel God's presence. I'm not alone in that. Many people feel absolutely dependent on God. I'm not alone in that, especially when they speak, when they stand up so courageously as our youth did today and spoke so eloquently and beautifully. Many people are fully dependent on God in that moment. Yet in spite of the progress that we've achieved in God inspiring us, in God leading us, in spite of the progress we've achieved, so often God doesn't seem to be present, even in people's words. In spite of the progress in civil rights that we commemorate with Martin Luther King Jr. Day tomorrow, we still have hate speech. We still have racism and bigotry. We live in a time when people can make statements that denigrate others based on the color of their skin. You know what? We should be past that. 55 years ago, King said, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. The psalmist reminds us that in everything we say, God is present and listening. We don't walk alone, even when we fall short, even when we fail miserably, even when we are witness to others falling so terribly short. You hem me in. God is with us. With that assurance, you would think that it would be easier. You would think, or I would assume, that life would be much smoother. Yet we still have fear, an ever-present fear. Fear motivates avoidance of vulnerability so that if one's fears prove true, one will have salvaged what is importantly at stake. Fear is universal. In spite of God's presence, even for those of us who profess an awareness of God's presence, an awareness of God with us in all moments, even those who know God can be afraid. Even those who appear fearless have some Achilles heel, some aspect of their lives that they would so desperately like to avoid having anyone else find out about. It's this fear that leads us to shirk back from the devotional courage of Psalm 139, and it allows us to point to things like episodes like Sarah Bedingfield's death and say, see, God isn't really searching out my path. I have every reason to be afraid. God doesn't call us to be afraid. God calls us to be courageous. I don't know anything about Sarah Bedingfield's life, but I know a little bit about each one of ours. And what I know is that each one of us have the gift of another day. We have the gift of this day, the potential, the possibilities that this day keeps and offers to us. We stand before God. And this day we can be alive and exhibit courage, knowing that God does stand with us. Not a distant, unengaged God who set the world in motion, wound it up like a clock, set it out, and walked away to be hands off forever. We stand before the Lord who searches us and knows us. God sees us in all things and in all situations, in the good, the bad, during celebrations and abysmal failures, during the highs and the lows. And as I look at my own life, and I reflect on this psalm and God's presence, I can see both. I can see those highs and I can see those lows, and I can reflect in hindsight on God being with me in both. Courage is complicated. Someone who is distinguished in one area can be an utter coward in another. We might not be able to undo some of the bad things that have happened. We cannot bring back someone who is gone, but we can join God in celebrating the good, recognizing God's presence and movement here and now and in the world. And we can follow God and speak good. We can speak truth. We can speak encouragement and words of love. I thought about some of my own highs and lows and reflecting on this psalm and where God was in those moments. Certainly one of the great high points of my life was the birth of my children. In Psalm 139, we see a testimony to God knowing those children before they were born. God as present in the miracle of their formation. God being there, celebrating with me in the moment of their birth. But then something interesting happened for me as I thought about this passage. I realized that is not my unique experience. God was there celebrating and present at the birth of every child, every person who has ever been born in history. God knows us, searches us, knows the depths of who we are. God is with us when we sit down. God is with us as we stand up. God looks at our paths before we travel them, and that's going to continue even after we leave this place. Even before we say something, God knows it. But the part that is most interesting for us is God doesn't choose our path or choose our words for us. God loves us. God cares about us and wants us to make good decisions. But God continues in every moment to give us the freedom to choose, the freedom to listen, the freedom to reflect, the freedom to acknowledge, like in our gospel lesson, who Jesus is for us. Love back the one who loves you. Amen.